Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to the April installment of the History Speaker Series. This evening, I'd like to start off by introducing you to the folks who are on screen. We have, of course, Judy, our speaker, who I will be giving a grander introduction to you momentarily. We have Trish, who is the head of the History Committee. We have Monica running the Zoom for us this evening, and they're running everything else behind the scenes too. I'm Lindsay. I am the history coordinator at OMAH. And so it's my pleasure to have you all here tonight. As many of you will know, if you've joined us for these evenings before, we will have a question and answer period after Judy's presentation is finished. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see two options, the chat and the Q&A. Try to put your questions in the Q&A, as that's the one we'll be paying more attention to when we do the Q&A at the end. Before we get started, I want to give a couple of thank yous for making these evenings possible. Firstly, a thank you to the OMAH History Committee under Trish's leadership, and especially to Marianne Grant, who coordinates with our speakers and does so much more beyond that. But these wouldn't be possible without Marianne. And also thank you to Janet Houston, another member of our History Committee, who put us in touch with Judy. Thank you to Deanne, who is our partner over at Rogers TV as well. Some of you may have seen us on Rogers. So we're so lucky to have a great partnership there also. And so finally, I'd like to give a big introduction to our speaker, Judy. So I have my notes here next to me. So now some of you may recognize Judy because we actually had Judy speak with us last year. It was a fascinating talk called Gravenhurst Prisoner of War Camp during the 1940s. And if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can see that talk on OMAH's YouTube channel. Judy has a degree in English with a history minor from the University of Western Ontario and a B.Ed from Queen's. She taught English in high schools in Brockville and Toronto before coming to Gravenhurst in 1973 to teach English at Gravenhurst High School. Eventually, Judy accepted an offer to open a library for the Office of the Fire Marshal at the Ontario Fire College, and Judy spent the next 20 years as a research librarian, retiring from her work there in 2012, and thus beginning her volunteer career with the Gravenhurst Archives, of which she became the head in 2015. Tonight, we welcome Judy with her talk, The Ontario Fire College, Then and Now. Take it away, Judy, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. I'll just say a couple of things before I actually dig right in here. The first thing I would like to say is thank you very much for joining me this evening. The second thing I'd like to say is I apologize for my voice quality. I've been ill for about a week and a half now. And although I'd like to think that I sound like Lauren Bacall, in fact, I don't. And so I may from time to time stop and take a drink of water as we go along. I'm hoping I will not lose my voice during the course of this 45-minute journey. I'm hoping to take you on a tour and a retrospective of what the Ontario Fire College and the sanatorium for tuberculosis that preceded it really has meant to both Gravenhurst and to the province of Ontario, and actually to the entire country. As we move through the history, I would repeat again, hold your questions until the end. If I haven't lost my voice, I will more than be happy to answer your questions then. I'll also be reminding people that this property has a history that actually extends all the way back to 1860. And if you'd like to query me on that at the very end, I can certainly entertain your questions there. But we have history and heritage galore on this particular property, and certainly the Ontario Fire College was the latest part of that history. Ontario Fire College may in fact not be all that you imagine it might be. you may in fact have ideas about what the Ontario Fire College was. I'm going to take you back in time to the very beginning of our story, a dirt road to the sanatorium. And I'm going to ask you to take a look at what you're seeing there. This is the road that went to the original sanatorium properties that were out there, and I will talk about those in a moment. I'm going to pause as well for a brief warning. Spelling and terminology have constantly evolved in our language, as you well know. It's not necessarily an evolution for the better, but it's an evolution nonetheless. You will see and hear references to a sanitarium, which you see at the bottom of this screen. You will also know perhaps that that word changed to sanatorium not too long after this particular photograph would have been taken. And while you will see the word sanitaria on a photo in a moment, in fact, we now speak of sanatoriums. The English teacher and the Latin student and me both rail at the changes, but what can we do? At one time, we would have spoken of firemen, but this is a change I'm thankful for. We no longer call firefighters firemen because many, many women have taken up the challenge of becoming firefighters. I'll use the terms fire officer and captain and company officer pretty much interchangeably because they are, in fact, pretty much words that mean the same thing. So let's begin, as I always do, by setting the stage for our tour of the Ontario Fire College. This map locates Gravenhurst Tuberculosis Sanatoria, and there were 4 of them, as some of you may know. I'll mention the first one here simply as a means of giving you an idea and of where it was and being sort of chronological in time. The first one is underlined on the map in red, and it says Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, 1897. In fact, it was the first sanatorium in Canada for the treatment of tuberculosis, and it was erected in 1896, opened in 1897 in Gravenhurst, Ontario. Truly the first then of all those sanatoriums. When TB had waned in its prevalence, some 60 years later, Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium was sold to become Muskoka Regional Center, a residential home for the mentally challenged. It would be closed by the government in 1994, and it remains closed to this day and unsold and uninhabited. So the pictures that you see there at the top is the original building of Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, and then the one below it, the Cottage Sanatorium at the far right of the picture, and at the far left is the Gage building, which was built to house many, many more people than had originally been planned for. The picture that we're looking at now contains the same map, but this time I'm going to introduce you to the Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives. It was also sometimes called Muskoka Free Hospital for the Consumptive Poor. It was built and opened in 1902 and was the first free hospital for the treatment of tuberculosis in the world, here in Gravenhurst. It provided treatment to those who could not pay or could pay only a little bit for their treatment. It would add a residence, and it would add something called shacks. Shacks, the name given to outdoor sleeping shelters that were open to the elements, presumed to be excellent for the cure of tuberculosis. It would add a farm, many outbuildings, which were open again to the elements, and original administration building shown here at the top on the left-hand side. And then you can see in the picture below that not only the administration building, but beside that, a walkway, and then the beginnings of a residential building there where the blue arrow is pointing. This is the sanatorium that will be at the heart of our story, for this is the sanatorium property that would become the Ontario Fire College. When tuberculosis had begun to decline or be conquered, as some of us thought, I guess, in the world, the National Sanatorium Association began to try to sell off some of the sanatorium properties that they owned. And one of these was the Muskoka Free Hospital for the Consumptive Poor. They weren't trying to sell off the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, but just the Consumptive Free Hospital. At the same time, in another part of Ontario, a man named William J. Scott, OBE, KC, LLB, was about to make history. He was the second fire marshal of Ontario, and some would say that he was a man possessed. Scott had been heavily involved in civil defense during the Second World War. He had been responsible for the monitoring of civil unrest and possible bomb threats or attacks on installations in Canada, those installations that would have been critical to our country in the war effort. So things like power plants, aircraft manufacturing industries, and so on. So he was the man who oversaw the safety of and the patrolling of and the protection of all of that infrastructure during the war in Canada. He was the only Canadian, for that matter, the only foreigner to have been invited to the United States to witness firsthand a nuclear bomb test in the Nevada desert. He had been named the Canadian representative to the NATO Civil Defense Committee, which regularly met in post-war England. And following the events of World War II and what he had seen in England, both during the war and after, and what he had seen in Canada and the US of fire and destruction during the war, he believed that we had to have a central training college in Ontario for the training of fire officers in the province. He fought long and hard, and finally in 1949, he was able to convince the government of the day that a fire college should be enshrined in legislation. And so it was in the Fire Departments Act of 1949-1950. This legislation authorized the building of a central fire college for the training of fire department officers. And please let me repeat that, the training of fire department officers. It also authorized the establishment of regional fire schools for the training of firefighters. So note the distinction that's being made here between fire officers, who were going to be instructed at the Ontario Fire College, and firefighters, the hands-on guys, who were going to be instructed at regional training schools and in their own departments. God had to wait for 7 years to get the funds and the property that he needed to open the Ontario Fire College of his dreams. Cities and towns competed for the opportunity to have such a place, just as they had competed to have the tuberculosis sanatoriums in their towns. But fate stepped in to bring together a fire marshal in want of a property and the Muskoka Free Hospital for the Consumptive Poor in want of an owner. And the Ontario government purchased it in 1957. Following refurbishment, it opened as the Ontario Fire College on the 22nd of August in 1958. Over 300 dignitaries and citizens attended the opening, coming from across Ontario, across Canada, from England, across North America. Let me take you back for a moment in that to that moment in time when you can see the official opening program on the left-hand side, as Kelso Roberts, who was the Attorney General of Ontario, on the left-hand side, and that's Fire Marshal Scott, W.J. Scott, on the right-hand side. Yellowing photographs here bear testimony to their age. This is a set of photographs taken in the 1958, 59, 60 era. The driveway shows a well-forested site, a car of the time facing the brand new entrance sign, and no subdivision in sight on the north-hand side at all, which of course is not true today. In the photo on the right, there's a residence building. That's the same residence building that we saw earlier when it was attached to the administration building of the sanatorium. It has now been painted and sits nestled in the trees circa 1959. Speaks volumes about W.J. Scott, who was never a patient man, that he opened the first course at the college before the college itself opened. In October of 1957, 40 fire chiefs from across Canada, the United States, and Great Britain attended a course on the hazards of radioactive materials. Was he prescient? Well, no, but as the fire service knows all too well today, CBRN responses, that is responses to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear incidents, would become all too plausible and all too much a mainstay of fire department training and emergency planning. Scott, of course, could never have imagined that on March the 20th, 1995, a domestic terrorism incident would take place in the subway in Tokyo, Japan, unleashing sarin gas on the unsuspecting passengers, killing 13 of them and injuring many, many more. He would never have been able to imagine that the 9/11 attack would occur in New York City, killing thousands. And never would he have imagined that on March the 11th, 2011, a major earthquake would unleash a tsunami, which in turn would overwhelm a nuclear power plant, causing the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. What we have learned is that fire departments have to respond to all these types of disasters. It's fire departments that respond to earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, wildfires, incidents of terrorism, and so on. Our world has become a very complicated place for the fire service, and fire officers must learn and had to learn right from the time the college opened to plan response and tactics for a wide variety of events. Where Canada was in so many ways a simpler place than it is today. Ontario Fire College programs would begin with courses needed by fire officer in the early 1960s. These would evolve over time to meet the changing needs of an evolving and changing society. So the changes in building materials, changes in hazardous materials, the awareness of the devastating impacts of fires on high-rise apartment buildings, schools, boarding houses, hotels, all of these would add up to a constantly changing curriculum that would help fire officers manage new and challenging fire operations. To prepare officers to manage these changing operations and departments, fire officers would attend the Ontario Fire College from across the province. It would be absolutely free. Both their board and their room and their meals, their everything, even the transportation was paid for by the Office of the Fire Marshal, all to provide for the safety of Ontario's citizens and put the least possible burden financially on municipalities and on fire departments. One thing that would not change is an emphasis on annual updating seminars for officers at all levels of fire departments. These updating 5-day conferences would provide the latest thinking at all levels of fire department operations by speakers brought in from all over North America. And they would continue right on until COVID-19 stopped them in 2020. When officers came to the Ontario Fire College in those first few decades, they stayed in that original sanatorium residence building that you see here. It has 40 men, and I say men with confidence because there were no women in the Ontario Fire Service at that time, strictly men. Accommodations and food services and dining arrangements were all pretty simple, as you can see. Looks almost like somebody's kitchen or something you would find in a B&B. The rooms were fairly simple. You'll see the heating done by rads and hot water. You'll also see in the bottom left-hand corner a storage vault for cobalt-60. Note the radiation hazard warning sign on it. This is just to show you that, in fact, even at the very, very beginning at the Ontario Fire College, Scott wanted everyone to be very aware of what would be coming in the future, and that is, if not right at that time, and that was the hazards of radiation. By the mid to the late 1990s, some 30 years later, the curriculum had evolved to meet the needs of a much more complicated department, now engaged in responding to an increasingly complex assortment of events and incidents. The curriculum had also advanced to meet the needs of the corporate side of the fire department, because remember, running a large or even a medium-sized urban fire department is basically running a corporation. The Fire College developed new partnerships with colleges and universities to provide courses in management and adult education. These partnering universities and colleges recognized and credited the courses that were taken at the Fire College as they did their own. The timing of courses would have to change and evolve too. Officers could not be away from departments for 3 weeks at a time as they had been in the beginning. They could only be away for perhaps a maximum of 2 or 3 days. Thus, much of the coursework was done by officers at their homes or at their home departments. They would then come back to the college for an intensive 2 or 3 day training period collaborative assignments and testing before being sent back to their fire departments to do post-course assignments. Where once a few recruits had been trained in the summer at the fire college, now that wasn't true. And for the most part, recruits and firefighters were trained at regional schools and in their own departments. On the left, you'll see a list of all the different types of company officers or captains. And you'll see how they evolve into higher and higher levels of responsibilities. So whereas you may have begun in a fire department as a fire prevention officer or a fireground commander, not begun, I guess, but after 10 years or so, you could eventually move up the ladder to district chief, platoon chief, division commander, and so on. Those are the kinds of ranks held in large fire departments. In the center, you see a list of all the kinds of operations that fire departments are involved in, besides regular, everyday firefighting. You've got auto extrication right through confined space rescue, aircraft rescue, water and ice rescue, through the spills of hazardous materials that happen when railroad cars, for example, come off the tracks. You've got disaster management like mass casualty events, terrorist incidents, bomb threats, and so on. And over on that right-hand side, you'll see what regional training centers were meant to do. They were meant to deal with firefighters at the first, second, and third class, and probationary or recruit firefighters. You would probably expect to be a firefighter for at least 5 years before you could even begin to think of applying to become a captain, one of those people on the left side of that screen. Now that we've set the stage, let's begin our tour of the Ontario Fire College and the kinds of training that went on there. Remember that this is a 100-acre site with over 2,000 feet of frontage on Lake Muskoka. We're talking prime development land here. We're beginning our tour of the Ontario Fire College at the upper level of the Fire College property. So really, if you could take a look for a moment at this aerial view, you will see in the right-hand bottom corner how the road is sort of disappearing in among the trees. That's actually the entrance to the property, and it comes in through the heavily forested area there, and then comes into the main property of the Fire College at the top or street level. It's a truly beautiful property. It's well treed. It features a lot of spreading lawns, and it used to feature some beautiful flower beds. And it was interspersed with typical Muskoka granite outcroppings as well. It's never been available to people to walk there or to cross-country ski there or anything like that. The property has always been off limits and to the public without an appointment. And that's because there are far too many dangerous spots to be and to get into if you didn't know what was going on the property at the time. Hence, very few people have ever walked this property or know very much about it. In the next photograph, I've named the buildings, and you'll be able to see what some of these were. This photograph, I'm going to begin you in the bottom left-hand corner, where it says 3 portable classrooms. You can see one of those 3 portables in the bottom left. Those were portable classrooms, and we'll talk about what they were used for. We're going to move up to that very long residence building, which is at the top center. The residential part is that long and narrow piece. Behind that is actually the dining room and kitchen area. Behind that is the instructor's house, that small building there. Up at the top, moving towards the right, you'll see the registrar's building. And then moving down the right-hand side, you'll see a large building called the Fire Tech Building. And at the very back of that, the very large square, is the library. And then moving right down to the very bottom of the picture and dead center is Scott Hall. I'm going to begin our tour with the residence building, and we're looking at the residence building as it looked in, say, 2020. Most of these photographs will show a very updated residence building, certainly starting in 2005 and moving through to 2020 when more upgrades and refurbishments were done. So you're looking here at a picture of security, and the front doors on the left-hand side there You'd have to stop at security and sign in. Security was staffed 24/7 by a company provided hired to provide surveillance. All the people on the property had to sign in when they were arriving on the property and sign out as they were leaving. Surveillance cameras on the property were monitored at this security area here for trespassers, who included the odd fox, a moose wandering by, deer, bear, and other such creatures. It was always not a bad idea in the evening, especially if you were alone and a young woman, to just take a quick glance at the camera before you went out to your car, making sure that nothing larger than you happened to be standing out there on its four legs. For 100 individual student rooms in the residence building, the residence building was opened in 1984. It was refurbished a number of times. It contained a computer lab, some study rooms, a boardroom for group work. The building was constantly updated and refurbished throughout its history, but in January of 2020, all 100 residence rooms were completely refitted, and you're looking at one right now, completely refitted with new beds, new desks, new chairs, new lamps, new flooring, and individual air conditioning units. Only a few rooms would ever be slept in. COVID stopped everything in its tracks, and it's pretty obvious to me, as it must be to you as well, that in fact, this college was not meant to be closed when all of this took place. The dining room had been refurbished as well. The dining room seated 150 people. There were usually 100 officers on campus for courses, along with members of the OPP, K9, and Marine units, which were also based at the Ontario Fire College property. So you might have 100 fire officers and perhaps as many as, well, not likely, but as many as 50 OPP officers as well could be there. There were other groups that were offered training at the Ontario Fire College. The Municipal Bylaw Enforcement Officers Association held their training on the Fire College property each year. And groups working on special projects, both from the Solicitor General's Ministry and from the Attorney General's Ministry, also arrived at the Fire College to use sequestered work areas and sequestered accommodations for sensitive discussions that they were holding. Initially, all services for fire departments were free. Other groups paid a per diem rate. When the Fire College was told in the early years of the 21st century that it had to recoup some of the cost of fire officer training, the college began to charge $65 per officer student per course for accommodation and meals. Now, $65 then covered 3 days, 3 nights of meals and accommodation. Not too expensive. In this 2021 photo, you can see that many of the tables and most of the chairs have been removed for disposal. These photographs were taken just before the Fire College closed, a month before it closed. There would normally have been many more tables and 4 chairs at each table. The windows that you see along the top left side of that top photograph, the windows looked out over the lake, and in summertime you could watch the Seguin go by, or the Winona, on the other side of Henry Island at about 10 o'clock in the morning. Lovely. At college or university, students paid modest student fees. The student fees were used to fund the lounge, and so they would buy things like the pool tables and the other kinds of games tables that you see there, the widescreen television eventually that went in, the comfortable lounge chairs where people could sit and talk, and so on. They also had a bar there. The bar did not open until after all classes were over, so that would be either 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We're going to leave the residence building behind at that point, and next we're going to talk briefly about a building that had been in use since sanatorium days. This is one of the original buildings from the Muskoka Free Hospital for Consumptives. The building on the top left is pictured in the 1950s, 60s era. The building in the center is probably from the mid-60s, and the building on the lower right is actually, that was a picture taken in 2021. Originally, this housed the chief doctor for the sanatorium and his staff. Various principals, when it became the fire college, lived in this house as well, until 1990, when it was deemed advisable that, in fact, the principal no longer had to be on the property. In 1990, the building became the registrar's office. So the registrar and the assistant registrar had their offices on the main floor. On the second floor, dignitaries, visiting instructors, and so on could be housed for the night or for the week when they were there. Now we're going to move to really what is the heart of the Ontario Fire College operations courses. Fire Technology Building, which opened in 1967. Originally, this building housed 4 fire apparatus bays and the maintenance mechanics office, and you'll see those 4 apparatus bays on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So there were fire trucks basically parked in there, and the maintenance officer was behind those. The rest of the tech building would stretch out to the right of the area and away to the back. The fire tech building also held all of the offices for the principal, the academic manager, the financial officer, registration before it moved to that old principal's house, the secretarial staff in the days when managers had to have a secretary in order to handle their correspondence. Of course, eventually they would handle their own. The print shop, 1 classroom on the second floor built in the style of an amphitheater, the fire engineer's office and lab. The fire engineer was responsible for fire investigation into fatal fires conducted through fire scene reconstructions and fire test burns. But in 2004 and 2005, the Fire College experienced major changes in the form of renovations and new buildings. In the photo on the right, you can see that those 4 apparatus bay doors, which you were looking at a moment ago, have now been changed completely, and they have become 4 sets of windows, floor to ceiling, the windows of a very new and a very modern classroom. Here's that aerial view again for a moment, and I've circled the whole new section added in 2005. The classroom in the front where the apparatus bays used to be, and the new library at the back, which I'll talk about later, that large square that you see in the circle. On the right is the new entrance atrium with reception area and rear service and delivery entrance behind that. And just to the left in that right-hand picture, sorry about the left and right, you can see the doors going into the resource center, or what was called the resource center. It was really the new library. In front of this picture, you can see boxes and boxes and boxes piled up and all the way to the back. The photograph was taken in February of 2021, just about 3 weeks before the Fire College was being emptied to be closed. In this set of photographs, on the left-hand side, you see the original classroom, which was an amphitheater on the second floor. The classroom held about 40 students and was completely refurbished in 2020. On the right, you can see the new additional very large classroom created out of that old fire hall where those apparatus stores were, that would easily accommodate 150 officers with a movable sliding wall to divide the classroom into 2 large spaces. The classrooms at the Ontario Fire College came in many shapes and sizes. A number of demonstration labs for fire prevention courses were created for hands-on learning. And here you can see a fire alarm lab showing the many different kinds of alarm systems that would be used in very many different types of occupancies. Labs like these gave officers from all sizes of department an idea of what might be out there in the way of alarm systems, and especially gave them a heads up if suddenly a new occupancy might be built in their jurisdiction and might have some of these kinds of alarm systems in them. So they were very much a hands-on learning lab system. There's more labs here. These demonstration labs provided hands-on experience with industrial kitchens, commercial kitchens, and their suppression systems, as well as suppression systems of other types on the right-hand side in that photograph. Again, all hands-on learning. Further kinds of labs, these are types of extinguishing and suppression demonstration labs. All of these labs were used for the training of fire prevention officers, the people who would have to inspect occupancies in their fire department jurisdiction and enforce building and fire code legislation. They would also be involved in fire cause determination, which is, of course, investigating the cause of a fire from the point of view of the building envelope and the systems involved in that building. A very different type of lab or classroom is this one. This time used for fire command officers, learning how to organize the resources of a fire department for response to a fire or some other type of emergency. This is what's called a tabletop exercise lab. And you may have heard various officials on television during a disaster or a potential terrorist incident telling how they had used tabletop exercises to prepare for the event that they were facing. In Washington, D.C., for example, during the occupation of the Capitol building not very long ago, officers of various responding agencies commented on their use of tabletop exercises to prepare for the possibilities of what would occur. The model buildings, roadways, rail lines, apparatus could all be moved around constantly and could be reconfigured to create incidents of increasing complexity. So you could have various colors of smoke added to show the presence of various types of chemicals. Different chemicals create different colors of smoke, yellow, green, red. Trains could be shown to be crossing rail lines just as you were about to drive an apparatus over them. That's a problem. Vulnerable exposures like hospitals, nursing homes, and schools could be added to the planning. The scene could be set in a small rural village, and you could have things like co-ops and barns and so on. Or you could have a major downtown thoroughfare in Toronto. The scene would be filmed from various vantage points using cameras and closed-circuit television. The commanding officer would be located in another room completely away from here, and with his limited perspective, based on what he could see on the television screen in front of him, which would sort of mimic what he would see at a fire, where he's literally standing in one place but getting feedback from other people about what's going on in other parts. He would position apparatus and manpower for maximum effect, always trying to be aware of the water supply, the exposures, the kinds of victims who might be in buildings, the kinds of chemicals that might be there, and so on. And then the rest of the class would critique his command structure. But just to bring us back to classrooms again, these photographs bring us back to the traditional classroom, the amphitheater above left, and the lower right-hand picture, the very large classroom. Just to give you an idea of how versatile classroom spaces were. But there were other types of classrooms besides these in the labs as well. In a quick diversion from the technology building for a moment, I'll just show you that, in fact, there were 3 portable buildings, portable classrooms, double wides, each of them, used mainly for the training of fire prevention officers in codes and standards. So in these classrooms, fire prevention officers would probably each have a table, or at least a half a table, to spread out the fire code, a huge document, the building code even larger, and many of the standards that would apply. And then they would be spending time with the instructor, learning about changes that were taking place to legislation, to codes and standards, and becoming familiar with all of those with the table where they could spread them out. Now I'm going to talk for a moment about my world for 20 years at the Ontario Fire College. I was contacted in late 1989 to see whether or not I would be interested in beginning a library at the Ontario Fire College. I was told it would be just a few hours a week, a few books, a few journals, and I had no idea that over the next 20 years, I would be enveloped in a whole new language, a whole new set of experiences with a dominantly male, completely male, really for most of the time, group of students. I loved it all. Working with the fire service was perhaps the most wonderful and fulfilling time of my life. I don't think anybody could work with a finer group of people than if they worked with the Ontario firefighters. You can see the small portable on the top left that I began in. And then when it got to be completely filled, because classes were sent to the library to work on assignments, and there was literally no place for them to go, we built a little piece that would join the front portable to another second double wide portable, and that was added on the back. But I grew out of that as well. And by 1995, things were getting to be pretty dicey in there. At that point, I had 2 full librarians and a part-time library tech as staff. In 2005, I took these photographs of the resource center. You can see between the stacks, tables and chairs for group work. Computer lab had been installed along one wall. And for the first time, library staff actually had offices, hard to imagine. And now, of course, with 2.5 staff members, that was pretty important. We had subscriptions to about 100 journals. We also had at least 8,000 titles by this time, although we would move on to 10 to 11,000 very shortly. Classes could be sent to the library to work at the tables. And at this point, the resource center was open from either 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday through Thursday, until 8 o'clock at night. So basically 12 hours, and then on Fridays until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is a resource center picture taken in 2021 when the library and the whole Fire College property was closing. And you can see that things were being brought into the library to be packaged up. So photographs and paintings and class sets of books and everything else was arriving from other classrooms and so on in that picture on the left-hand side. And the picture on the right-hand side just gives you an idea of the stocks and the materials that were there. Doesn't sound like a cottage or a college closing, does it, when they actually moved all of the library of the Office of the Fire Marshal in Toronto up to the Ontario Fire College Resource Center and placed all of their materials in there as well. However, closing it was. Now for something completely different again. Having looked at the upper level of the Ontario Fire College property and the courses that were offered in classrooms and labs, let's move down to the fire suppression side of the fire department, operations taught at the Ontario Fire College. And I'm going to take a moment for a quick drink as I change slides. This is the lower level of the Ontario Fire College property. And you can see in the, well, actually the far distance, you can see Lake Muskoka as it is out there, and perhaps even a steamship by the looks of it out in the middle of the water. But you can also see the places that we just visited in the upper sort of left-hand quadrant of that screen. You can see the tech building and the residence building and so on. But now we're down below that. You came down a fairly steep hill down to the lower level, the lower half or 2/3 of the property really at the Ontario Fire College. It's a part that a lot of people thought was the only thing that took place at the Fire College, when in fact it was probably the least important of all the things that took place. Again, I've labeled this photograph to show you where some of the buildings were. So there's that residence building we were in and the fire tech building we were in up there at the top. But now we're looking at a fire hall over on the extreme right top. And we're looking at fireground burn buildings and the fire research building. And we'll talk about these for a moment too. So let's begin, first of all, a third of the way down the hill toward the fireground. This was built in 2005, completely brand new. You can see here the complete renovation of the property extended through a rock cut. They had to put a road through a rock cut and put in a fire department or a fire hall to replace that fire apparatus area that had been taken over for classrooms. So now, in fact, we had a brand new fire hall. It had 5 apparatus bays. It had a classroom, offices for the fleet manager. And it took 2 years for them to put in both the road through the rock cut that you see there and another road that went down to the actual fire ground. Here, the fire officers, seconded from various fire departments, would be involved in training people in how to manage and conduct a fire. We're going to head for the fire ground next. There you can see the fire training tower. It's actually a tower of 4 stories. Once you've hit the 4 stories, that could be a 20-story or a 50-story building, but you've basically got the idea of the stories. And on the right-hand side, you've got a suburban split-level house. In that suburban split-level house, you can see that they have a fire that has been set inside the building, and enough of a fire to bring smoke out through the windows and so on. Response teams would follow the commands of fire officer in charge. The teams would debrief before and after each of the exercises. And at the end of the day, they return to the fire hall that we just saw, be off to the showers, and then be ready to, in fact, clean all their SCBA and so on. There were numerous other small buildings in this lower part, and I won't talk about any of the others other than just 2. On the top left-hand side, you see what looks like a rail car, and you're right, it is a rail car, but it's been specially fitted to become a flashover unit to provide flashover training to fire department personnel. It actually, along with 2 or 3 others, were mobilized throughout the province, and they went from department to department and taught people about flashover and let them experience what a flashover would feel like. Somebody wants to question me about what a flashover is, I can talk about that at the end. The other building I wanted to draw your attention to is the Fire Research Building for reconstruction of fire scenes, which is that building labeled A up in the top right-hand corner. In that building, the fire research engineer would reconstruct fire scenes absolutely accurately using a hospital bed identical to the hospital bed that had been used in been in a fire. We had a carpenter, a painter, a plumber, and an electrician, all with papers, working at the Ontario Fire College, so they could recreate anything from a jail cell to a small shop, to a hospital room, to you name it, anywhere where a fire had taken place that was fatal and that looked as though it had better be looked into very vigorously because something, was very wrong. Using thermocouples, thermal imaging cameras, the fire would once again rage in whatever they had built, and the fire engineer would be able to watch and then record and then study all the elements that had contributed to the fire, and then make recommendations regarding new standards for building materials, for paint, for bedding, whatever it happened to be. On the bottom left there, you can see the firefighters and the fire operations commanders, in other words, the fire captains and officers there, and they're all meeting to debrief before they're going to tackle another fire. We're going to move away from the fire ground to see other parts of the property now. Moving halfway back up the hill, but on a different road than the one we took down, we're going to stop for a moment at the Firefighters Memorial that was erected by the Provincial Firefighters Association in 1988 and was dedicated by Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander. You can see the memorial itself on the left-hand side, a beautiful thing. And on the right-hand side, you can see the fire officers who would attend the memorial service in October of each year. Now, there are memorials and memorial services in a number of communities in Ontario. Many communities have them. Toronto, Kitchener, and so on have such memorials as well erected there. This was an opportunity for volunteer firefighters to come and pay respect to those men who had lost their lives. You can stop at this building, which is now back up again on the top of the property, or on the street level of the property, upper level. But we've come around to it now. This was the instructor's house. This is an original building to the old sanatorium property. It was a building where the doctors had their offices, and under the Ontario Fire College, the instructors, 10 instructors, had their offices in this building. This is where they planned their courses, marked papers, and so on. was a museum for a while at the Ontario Fire College. It opened in 1987, but was emptied not very long after that because it was poorly designed and it was not really suitable to be a museum. It became, however, a very useful building because once we had 9/11 occurring and so on, we ended up with a mobile hospital unit in there and other disaster supplies and so on. So a very, very important building. The OPP, as I've mentioned before, had their operations on our property as well. The OPP K9 unit had quite a large, substantial piece of land at the Fire College where they had props and jumps for their dogs. They had a Quonset hut. They had an office building. They also used the property of the Muskoka Regional Center, which is that old sanatorium property, for dog training. And people who lived in Gravenhurst regularly saw OPP officers out with their dogs on the street. At the bottom, you can see the OPP Marine Unit and the kinds of vessels that they had. They ate meals sometimes at the Fire College, but generally speaking, were gone at the end of the day. And now I'm going to introduce you to the pièce de résistance, and that is Scott Hall, originally called Massey Hall. It was built by local stonemasons and carpenters with funds from the Massey family of Massey Ferguson, Massey Harris fame, the Massey Hall in Toronto, the Fred Victor Mission, Massey College at the University of Toronto. All of those things were funded by the Massey family, who did believe in charitable works, but they also had experience with tuberculosis. Chester Massey had lost a brother to tuberculosis, and so he wanted to have something that dealt with tuberculosis built at the sanatorium. And that's why Massey Hall was built there. A beautiful building, possibly one of the nicest buildings in all of Muskoka. It's not really changed interior-wise or exterior-wise in its entire life. And it was opened in 1914. So we're talking about a building that's well over 100 years old, and a beautiful one at that. Massey intended the building to be used for religious services, but in fact, it was used as well and much more often for movies and for plays staged on the stage there for the patients of the sanatorium. It became a classroom under the Ontario Fire College jurisdiction and was renamed in 1962 for W.J. Scott and called Scott Hall, therefore, the driving force behind having an Ontario Fire College. He died quite suddenly, actually, in 1960 while he was packing to leave for a NATO conference in England. And he was a Canadian delegate to that conference. And so to honor him, they changed the name. The photo on the right shows the main entrance, which is seemingly at the back of the building, but you have to remember that this building was built in 1914 when neither the road nor the homes on it, nor anything about that entire property looked quite the same. The interior is incredibly beautiful. Ceiling is like a ship's hull and very much like several buildings in Gravenhurst, including St. James Anglican Church, an appropriate feature for a building that's in a town famous for steamships and boat building. The only thing that's really changed in Scott Hall, and I think done fairly well, was the use of those braces, those black braces on the top right-hand side, and in the middle you can see them again. I think that they were designed in sympathy with the original beams, just to provide additional support for the roof. Notice that there was a proscenium arch in that left-hand picture over the stage. The center photo shows the floor-to-ceiling windows in Scott Hall, used to admit fresh air to the tubercular patients. The fireplace on the right was a working fireplace, beautiful woodwork surrounding it, and a plaque and a picture of W.J. Scott, a plaque honoring him and his work. I'm not going to stop at the plaque for more than a second to say that it details all of the positions that he held in the international fire world and in civil defense organizations. This picture gives you a view of the interior of Scott Hall that's quite good. At the far back of the room, you can see a square over the doorway. That's actually the projection box or the projection screen facing towards the stage where people could watch first-run movies that were actually sent to the sanatorium in the early days for patients. The photograph was taken during a municipal heritage event in Gravenhurst, doors open in 2016. During the 3 hours that we were allotted to have that building open to people, 100 people toured the building. The display on the left showcased the sanatorium history. The display on the right showcased the Ontario Fire College history. And that's me waving my arm wildly in the breeze to show that something existed over in that direction. Historical artifacts from the museum were moved into the fire protection building and the fire technology building, and we're putting cases there for people to look at. This photograph is just to give you an idea. This was taken in 2018 and shows one of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of graduating classes at the end of one of the programs that they had undertaken. And you can see all the different ranks there denoted by the stripes on the arms. And you can see as well departments, if you can see their badges from a lot of different departments. In conclusion, the Ontario Fire College for 63 years was a very, very busy place. Thousands of officers were enrolled each year in various courses. And I'm saying thousands, as many as 2,000 would be enrolled a year in courses and at various stages and levels of the company officer programs. Officer development was being done at a nominal cost to fire departments and municipalities. And most important of all, the officers were able to learn from each other in group work, in classes, in the halls overnight, in the lounge over a beer. They could argue and question each other and hear about new equipment and better ways to do a task. And they could go back and change their own fire services. Was it to last? We may never really understand the reasons behind the closure of the Ontario Fire College, those put forth by the people who make the decisions. Those reasons have not really satisfied many of the small and medium-sized fire departments in the province of Ontario, but I guess times change. Whatever the reasons and whatever the future, the Ontario Fire College closed on March the 31st, 2021. Gates have been installed and they're locked and your entrance is barred. Infrastructure Ontario is presently in the process of evaluating the historical value of the property. Given Bill 23 recently passed, the heritage or historical value of the property may be moot and hold little sway in the future of the Ontario Fire College. All I can do is pray that Scott Hall, if nothing else, is preserved for the future. And at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Judy. I learned a ton. That was awesome. So yeah, as Judy said, if you'd like to pose any questions, you are welcome to. You can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will put them forward to Judy. And then after the Q&A, we're going to turn things over to Trish, who's going to give us, among other things, some insight into the upcoming presentations as well. So Judy, we've got one here from Kathy, actually a comment, but a lovely one. So Kathy says, after the center transitioned from a TB hospital to a home for the mentally handicapped, I worked there for 4 summers and it covered my university tuition. When it became the fire college, my uncle Phil Clark from Gravenhurst was in charge of security. Thank you for the historical update of an important part of my hometown.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. And then we've got some questions coming in as well. So from Merle, what happens to the resource materials from the library?
Thank you for asking that question. The first time I did this presentation, was very shortly after the place had closed, and I could not get an answer to that question. I'm still looking for an official answer to that question, but I understand that the library materials, which I had thought went to the University of Toronto, that's what I was told at first. I think they actually went to the Office of the Fire Marshal sub-office in Midhurst. That's my understanding, although I cannot imagine how they took in 10 or 11,000 volumes. So I still have not got a good answer. I tried to get an answer from the Office of the Fire Marshal, and they have not contacted me back.
From Janet, how are fire officers trained now?
What a good question. I wish I could answer with a lot of what should we call it, with aplomb and enthusiasm. I gather that they are continuing to take courses through universities and community colleges in the management of an organization. In terms of managing fires, I believe that they're doing that through regional training centers. If you're living in a large city like Toronto, they have their own training centers, Kitchener the same, and even some medium departments have a training center. But generally speaking, for small volunteer and small composite departments, I don't know. I don't know what's happening with them. I really don't. I've talked to a number of fire chiefs, and I just don't really want to comment any further.
And that actually addresses Anne's question as well. Interesting question here from Deanne. Do you know a bit about the history of women firefighters as it relates to the Ontario Fire College?
Women were not encouraged to join the fire service for a very long time. About the time that I joined the fire service, which was, 1989, 1990, there were hints that a few departments in the United States were being challenged to open their doors to women firefighters. That happening probably spread to Ontario, as everything does from the United States. I think as well, women were taking a much more decisive stand about what they could do as well as men. And in actual fact, they have to meet exactly the same standards as any male recruit for a fire department. There's no different standard. In actual fact, you'll hear my voice is getting worse here. I'm sorry. In actual fact, women are often able to do things that men can't do. If they happen to be smaller, they can get into a basement window much more easily than a very large 250-pound firefighter. So there are a number of advantages and so on for men and women. By the late 1990s, there were a number of women joining the fire service. There were women also joining the fire service at the management level, because of course there are lots of women with MBAs and public administration degrees and so on. And so they were also coming into the fire service as administrators. There were women coming in as training officers as well, because they too have degrees in adult education and so on. So there are so many positions available to women, and that has really been true since the late 1990s and getting better and better every year.
Great. So let's wrap it up then. We have a comment from Dave who says, I have several memories having attended the college grounds for training and meetings, etc., with the OPP over the years. Thank you for an entertaining summary and especially the photos, helping put it all in order this many years later. Sad to see the college go. Another thank you from Nellie as well for the walk down memory lane. Nellie says, I spent many, many weeks at the fire college over my career in the fire service, retiring this year after 25 years. Congratulations on your retirement, Nellie.
Yes, congratulations, Nellie Green.
Yeah. And so let's wrap it up here and give your voice a break. We'll just have our final question here, similar to the first one, but what became of all the historical artifacts that were on display in the museum or Scott Hall?
Luckily, we had fairly good records for a number of the things and where they had come from. Some of them had actually been placed on the property, sort of on loan, if you like. So in the case of apparatus that I mentioned, that had been in the museum, they went back to the fire departments that they came from, or the personal owners. A lot of the other items, smaller and medium, went back to owners as well. Some of the rest of the artifacts have gone back to the Office of the Fire Marshal headquarters in Toronto.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you to everybody for your questions and comments. We're going to turn it over to Trish now, who's going to wrap things up for us. Over to you, Trish.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to say a very special thank you for Judy for agreeing to be our guest speaker, returning as our guest speaker, this time with her very informative presentation on the history and contributions of the Ontario Fire College. Your wealth of knowledge is just amazing, and knowing that you're feeling a little under the weather tonight, I really appreciate you being here and sharing that with us. It's so very, very important. Thank you. A very special thank you to all in attendance tonight as well. It's wonderful to have so many local history enthusiasts from near and far join our history speaker series. The OMAH History Committee not only sources history presenters and facilitates these speaker events, but we also celebrate local history through research and writing of articles that are included in the OMAH's monthly eMuse news. It's a newsletter that is sent out to OMAH members only. So a few topics that we have covered in the past, for example, include Aurelia's Winter Carnival, the Martinville Lumber Camp, and Chief Yellowhead's Justice. So as a member of OMAH, you would not only be supporting this very wonderful museum and all the benefits associated with that, but you would also learn more, or even more, of Aurelia and Regent's fascinating past. So if you aren't already, you may consider becoming a member of OMAH. And so for our schedule for our speaker series, we have changed slightly since we last talked. So for the next few months, we have on Wednesday, May 21st, our guest speaker is Rob McCron. He's the Aurelia Legion's museum curator, and he's going to recount the time when warships known as the Fairmile were built at Hunter Boats, a shipyard located on Lake Couchiching's waterfront during the Second World War. And with the Mariposa Folk Festival on the horizon in early July, it's fitting to host Mike Hill, its former artistic director, as our guest speaker on Wednesday, June 21st. So we're going to have a June speaking event as well, who will share 60 years of Mariposa. So we'll learn about history of one of Canada's iconic cultural events, its roots in Aurelia, and about the many interesting people involved in staging this amazing folk festival. So we look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks again for your support, and have a lovely evening. Take care.